Well, between the upcoming endangerment finding and the climate talks in Copenhagen, the EPA is going to be squarely in the middle of these issues. And yesterday, Clean Skies' Dan Goldstein talked with former EPA Administrator Stephen Johnson about where the agency needs to go in dealing with greenhouse gas emissions under President Obama and his response to accusations that the Bush White House dragged its feet on regulating them. Dan is in our newsroom now. So Dan, tell us where Johnson stands.
Well, Susan, if this was going to be a title fight, it would have the name of Johnson versus Jackson. Obviously, Lisa Jackson would be in the blue corner. But the real thing about Johnson's view is he's very adamant that the Clean Air Act is not the best way to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And when I talked to him, he really explained about why he felt that the Bush administration was right in rejecting that approach in 2007, which, as you remember, was part of that controversial email that was leaked out last week by the EPA itself under Jackson, which indicated that the Bush White House and the Office of Management and Budget didn't even open the emails that the EPA had sent to them. But Johnson said he defended the decision and saying that he was right because, in his words, Congress did the right thing in acting first, because the whole thing about the endangerment finding was how it related to automobiles, and that Congress had acted first by basically creating tougher CAFE standards for fuel economy. And the bottom line, Susan, and in my interview you'll see, he really wants a he wants a legislative, not a regulatory approach to climate change, and he would rather see a kind of a market-based solution, which probably is pretty consistent with what you'd expect from someone who worked under the Bush administration. But he does want to see some form of legislation. Now, he did not say that he was willing to commit to what was under what we're seeing right now through Kerry Boxer. And here's a little piece of my interview with him. You're very much in the view that this should not be handled by the EPA through the Clean Air Act, but it should be handled legislatively. Can you tell us more why you think that it should be a legislative vehicle and not through the EPA?
Well, while the Clean Air Act has served the nation well over the plus 20 years and certainly since 1990, it was not enacted to address a global air pollutant or global air pollution such as greenhouse gases and CO2. There are a number of significant limitations. For example, there's a question whether in fact the EPA can even use a market-based approach to address it using the current Clean Air Act. It can't address international issues. It can't allow the United States to enter into the international carbon market. There are severe limitations that can only be addressed through legislation. That's why I personally am a proponent of good legislation that will replace an old, ill-suited Clean Air Act.
Is Kerry Boxer good legislation in your view?
Well, I'm not going to comment on specific legislation. I think that there are a number of good points, that in fact that it's a legislative approach. Again, I think that there are a number of key questions that have to be asked, including, does the United States want to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors of our economy? In other words, economy-wide. Are we serious about, are we going to regulate homeowners and hospitals in addition to coal-fired power plants or factories? Are we going to regulate agriculture? I mean, these are significant questions that have to be addressed, both as we look at it as a country to address it, but also as we begin discussions and hopefully negotiations internationally.
But even in your administration, in the last days, in December of 2007, there was the famous email that went out that said, we need to look at this seriously. Now, according to the EPA, according to just the FOIA that just came out 2 weeks ago, that email with the endangerment finding, with a proposal, wasn't even opened by the Bush White House, by your administration.
Right,
Why was that?
Well, let me explain. Remember, the purpose of the email was responding to the Supreme Court decision which dealt with cars and light trucks. Well, Congress had just before that passed new legislation requiring the country to raise the CAFE standard. That is the way you address greenhouse gases, and particularly CO2, from automobiles and light trucks. So the endangerment finding was really a moot point from a policy perspective and from a legal perspective with regard to automobiles and light trucks, the subject of the Supreme Court decision. The reason why it's so significant is because the way the current Clean Air Act is constructed, that once you find endangerment for a lawnmower or for an automobile, then that finding applies to every other source. And so that's the law. And so rather than open up Pandora's box of trying to understand what to regulate and what not to regulate, it was a conscious decision. The Congress had just passed a new law. It was the law that was going to raise the CAFE standard, which in fact addressed climate change from the sources subject to the Mass versus EPA decision. And so, and also, as little attention is paid to, I issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking outlining all of the issues, both this problem of finding endangerment for mobile sources and how it impacts stationary sources, as well as characterizing all of the issues, including international, including cap and trade versus carbon tax, and all these issues. And in fact, I issued that over the objection of the Office of Management and Budget, as well as my cabinet colleagues, because that I thought it was important to lay out all of the issues so that as the debate and as the evaluation continued, whether regulatory through the Clean Air Act or through legislation, that they would have the basic information to be able to make informed decisions.
But you don't think that the Bush administration literally was trying to slow walk or put off that decision that it looks like the Obama administration is willing to make?
Well, and again, it was the decision that was before the agency and subject to the Supreme Court dealt with cars and light trucks. Once Congress had passed legislation raising the CAFE standard, that was addressing it. And so this was viewed by many as a backdoor to getting to coal-fired power plants and factories and other kind of sources, including agriculture and even including homeowners. And so rather than use this as a backdoor approach where there had not been any discussion, any policy debate, I felt that it was important to segment this, focus on trucks and cars, and issue a CAFE standard that raise the fuel economy across the nation, which the President Obama certainly supports, and then focus on the other sources and then make some intelligent decisions balancing both environmental, economic, energy independence, as well as national security issues, which all come to play in how we as a nation address these greenhouse gases.
Now, as you heard too, Stephen Johnson has a lot to say on what the United States should do at Copenhagen. He said that no matter what, the U.S. has to lead those talks coming up in December. But he also was very critical too of the decision, apparently, that, or at least the talk that is that you heard yesterday and obviously today, that President Obama may not go to Copenhagen, perhaps to avoid the embarrassment that occurred the last time, obviously, when he made the bid for the 2016 Olympics and fell quite short. And he's very, very concerned that the symbol will be that Obama will go to Europe to pick up his Nobel Prize, but not to go to Copenhagen to lead these very important climate talks. And he says, quote, that sends the wrong signal to the United States and nations across the world. And Susan, will have this interview obviously posted on our website, cleanskies.com, so there'll be a lot more to look at. Susan?
We'll check the website for that full interview. Dan Goldstein, thank you.